Hey folks, here at OS Reviews, you're watching our throwback review of the Samsung Galaxy S5 Mini here in 2018. We'll be discussing in this video whether this is still a worthwhile option to pick up as a budget phone over 3 years later. The phone itself came out in the summer of 2014, and of course it was the miniaturized version of the flagship Galaxy S5. So it has many of the attributes carried over from its larger sibling, including a plastic construction that was unfortunate because it was one of the last times that Samsung actually used plastic on one of their flagship phones before moving into glass and aluminum on the S6. But it also is completely waterproof. Despite the fact that it looks like an ordinary phone and all the ports are completely revealed, you can actually submerge this in 1.5 meters of water for up to 30 minutes. So you can take it with you when you go to the beach, you can take underwater images and videos, which is actually pretty cool. If I remove the back cover, which I guess is one of the benefits of having a plastic back, you can see the rubber seals that helps the waterproofing technology stay put. There's also the addition of a 2,100 milliamp hour capacity battery. Other specifications of the S5 Mini are, of course, not quite as strong as the actual S5. You have an 8 megapixel sensor as opposed to 16 megapixels on the S5. That gives you less detail and resolution, so you can't zoom and crop in on your images quite as much. However, it still is a pretty decent sensor, even here in 2018 compared to other budget or mid-tier smartphones. It captures sufficient detail as well as light, and it actually does a good job of focusing as well as giving you good depth of field, as we'll see in a moment. Some other quirky features carried over from the S5 include a biometric heart rate sensor. This is not a feature that you'll find on any smartphone anymore, but back then Samsung was really pushing for health features on their phones, and this was one of the additions, in addition to being able to track your steps using the accelerometer, and it picks up all that information, including your pulse, into their proprietary S Health app, which actually is a okay replacement for a fitness tracker if you wanted some very basic functionality. We also have access to, underneath the hood, a proprietary Samsung Exynos 1.4 GHz quad-core processor coupled with 1.5 gigs of RAM. Now this is the area that I was most concerned about because the RAM and the processing package seems no longer very powerful at all, even as a mid-tier device. Most phones now come with 2 gigs, even 3 gigs of RAM as a minimum on Android. With that being said, when I was testing this out, and as you'll see when we start going in over the software, it actually still handles multitasking decently well. I would say the overall package is very similar to a phone running on a Snapdragon 400 or 410 chipset today. So again, you are looking at a budget-oriented smartphone and not a flagship by any stretch, but it still works and handles most of your web browsing and video streaming needs without any problems. Taking a closer look at the design of the S5 Mini first, again, it's very comfortable to hold using one hand. Despite the fact that everything is made out of plastic, again, feels relatively comfy. I'm not a fan of the chrome-edged plastic, however, because it shows wear and tear very easily, and they are using a micro USB port on the bottom for charging, in addition to a standard 3.5mm headphone jack for music on the top, which again is the benefits of picking up a slightly older device. There's also the presence of a IR blaster, which is a fun feature carried over from the S5, and again, you won't find this feature anymore on most modern phones. It allows you to more easily control your television, DVR, and Blu-ray players from the comfort of your sofa without having to reach for individual remotes. Another feature that the S5 Mini kind of was special for, or known for the time, was its fingerprint scanner on the front, a feature carried over from the bigger S5. It was one of the first kind of mid-tier smartphones to come with a biometric fingerprint scanner. Today, this feature is ubiquitous, and we find it even with budget offerings, so it's nice to see it present on a slightly older hardware as well. The addition of a fingerprint scanner means you can have mobile payment solutions set up, such as paying for PayPal or Google Wallet services just by scanning your finger. Now, the fingerprint scanner isn't quite as responsive or easy to use as on a modern sensor where you simply have to tap to unlock. On here, it still requires a physical swipe, so it's a little bit more tedious. However, the overall experience is still fast, responsive, and fluid. The screen is a 4.5-inch Super AMOLED panel with 720p resolution. Because it is 4.5 inches, we actually get a pretty high 326 ppi. So it's not 1080p or 4K, but since it is a smaller size, it's really not needed. Text as well as the images are sharp, they're colorful, saturated, and because of the AMOLED nature, we have very good color saturation that really pops out and jumps out more than you would find on an LCD panel. In terms of size comparison, here it is next to a 5-inch phone. You can really tell the difference there. And with a even larger device, such as a 5.5-inch screen, you just get a sense of how much smaller this phone feels. And it's, again, very easy and comfortable to grip and access everything using one hand. All right, so taking a close look at the interface here, we are talking about TouchWiz, which is polarizing in the sense that some people love it, some people hate it, but it does give you lots of features built in, and overall, it does present a pretty colorful and vibrant user interface. You can see that for general navigation, the phone still feels quite snappy and responsive. The downside is, again, that there's a ton of bloatware in TouchWiz, and since the version that I have here is on contract with AT&T here in the United States, there's a lot of preloaded apps from AT&T as well. So a large portion, about 16 gigabytes, is already taken up by many Google services, Galaxy services from Samsung, some games and trial version of games, AT&T things like Yelp. There's also going to be AT&T Smart Wi-Fi, Amazon Kindle, so you can tell that there's a ton of things built on here. Some of them are useful, some of them which maybe you can delete if you don't want to use them. The phone now runs on Android 5.1 Lollipop. That is the latest update that the phone can receive, and on this particular version, if I swipe over to the left of the display, we have access to a flipboard where I can customize with my favorite news as well as email and social media updates from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc., and it flows in depending on the categories that you set. It presents a pretty nice interface for you to quickly read these articles in a way that's more optimized for scrolling back and forth, and it actually works pretty well. Over here, we do have access to a few other screens that you can add with your favorite widgets. I can, of course, pinch out to have a look at more options in terms of customization. I can swipe down using 2 fingers to have access to the full drawer of settings that I have on TouchWiz. You can see quite a lot here. Have access to what's called a toolbox that brings up this little dot that I can customize with my most commonly used applications. So for instance, if I want to use something like the torch very often, I can set that there, and whenever I tap on that, the flashlight will automatically turn on. So I can set that up for my commonly used apps if I wanted to. The phone itself does come equipped with all the modern sensors that we expect on a flagship, and that includes NFC, that includes GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, so all those things are built on in. There's also a S Finder, which is kind of a universal search bar that I can use to search up all the programs, notes, and contacts on the phone. And there's also a ultra touch sensitive mode that allows you to access the display even when you're wearing gloves. So for instance, if I'm tapping the phone using my nails, it will still be fully functional here. However, turning this feature off, you'll see that it no longer works if I try to move it with a fabric, a glove, or even using your nails. So this actually does make a difference in terms of the sensitivity. So it actually is a pretty interesting technology that they built on here, similar to some Nokia phones in that sense. The home button here, again, which is the fingerprint scanner, also dubs as a smart key. I can, of course, tap once to go back into this main screen. I can also tap twice to access Voice, which is Samsung's proprietary kind of search assistant. So it competes with the likes of Cortana or even Google Assistant. It works pretty well, but it doesn't give you always, the most accurate kind of responses. Of course, I can also long hold to access Google Now or the traditional Google Assistant for other searches. So again, it gives you quite a few options there. The capacitive keys here down below are backlit. They allow me to open up the multitasking drawer. You can see that right now we have a slew of apps open, and the performance still remains actually pretty snappy. So again, the RAM management on here, despite the fact that it's only 1.5 gigs, actually works surprisingly well. Taking a look at some of the more specific features of the phone next, we can take a look at S Health, which actually works pretty well in terms of the accuracy of the steps based on the accelerometer, and you can take a look at trends, your calendar, set up goals for each day, and it actually gives you a fairly good amount of details and data that you can explore and visualize with the settings here. The heart rate sensor also works actually pretty well. Again, I place my finger here behind the below the camera sensor, and it uses kind of this light to detect your pulse. So here is the measurement right now. So right now, let's say that I'm excited, it's going to tell me the average, and I can save that. So again, it's able to kind of track that in addition to trends, what my personal average is at particular points in time, and you can see that down below. So that is the S Health function. Again, pretty unique. You won't find that on any mid-tier phone that's out now in 2017 or 2018 anymore. The same thing can be said about the IR Blaster, which controls the television set. You'll find that feature in the Smart Remote app, and again, it works pretty well. Jumping into the camera performance next, as aforementioned, 8 megapixels doesn't sound very high on paper. The field of view also isn't really wide. However, it does focus really quickly. You can actually continuously focus, and it follows your finger around at multiple points. The sensor itself is actually surprisingly good for only 8 megapixels. It focuses, again, pretty well, and even under low light environments, it automatically adjusts the aperture and mode settings by itself. Compared to the same kind of 8 megapixels on the Galaxy S3, it actually is significantly better. In fact, it is one of the better sensors on a mid-tier phone, even now in 2018. You can play around with a wide range of settings. You can even change, again, the geotagging, the aperture yourself, ISO, things like that. And from here, I can select a different type of mode like beauty, panorama, virtual tour, HDR, so on and so forth. If we take a look at some of the sample images that I just took there, overall the images themselves turn out actually surprisingly well. Again, colors are very accurate looking, and although it doesn't, again, give you the most details when you start to zoom all the way in, from afar at least, it actually produces a pretty pleasant looking image. And again, more megapixels doesn't always denote a better camera. There are many other variables that determine whether a camera performs well, and you can see here that overall the image quality on this particular unit is actually pretty good. It exceeded my expectations, at least, when revisiting this device. So solid image performance. Video quality in terms of the camcorder also works fairly well. You can record up to 1080p, but unfortunately there is no 4K video recording. With that being said, the microphone does a good job of picking up your voice. There is noise cancellation, and overall, even in outdoor environments, it seems to do a pretty reasonable job. When it comes to phone call quality, I tested it out with AT&T, since this is the AT&T version. This is a quad-band GSM device, and reception quality seems to be also fairly decent. I consistently received roughly 3 bars or so in terms of signal strength here in the Seattle region, and I had no drop calls in my testing, so as a phone, it also performs quite well. So now if we talk a little bit about the battery performance of the Galaxy S5 Mini, the good thing again is that this is a device where you can swap out the battery. That is no longer a feature that you'll find on many modern flagships or even mid-tier phones. In general, the phone will last for about a day to a day and a half depending on what you're using it for. So battery performance is decent, but it's not going to be dramatically better than a modern mid-tier device. So even though it has a 720p panel, and not 1080p or 4K, the battery does seem to drain, a little bit faster than I was expecting, probably because the capacity of the unit isn't quite as large as many newer phones these days that comes with a 3000 or in some cases even a 4000 milliamp hour pack. So battery life is passable, but it's not one of the strengths of the S5 Mini. Alright, so now let's jump into the web browsing experience, and while we're talking about web browsing, we can also take a look at some sample videos. So here I was browsing through mobile eBay and taking a look at what the average pricing for the S5 Mini currently is, and as aforementioned, you can find it for under $80, or so it seems. If we jump into something like the New York Times, this should be a good benchmark. One of the areas where the S5 Mini has a sacrifice would be in the typing experience. I always find a larger phone with larger display more comfortable to type on. You just simply get larger keys. And of course, Samsung's custom keyboard here, although it's very good in terms of predictive text, and their screens are very sensitive and have good haptic feedback, unfortunately the keys themselves are pretty small, especially on a 4.5-inch screen, and then they shrink it down even more on this particular layout. So it does remind me of the days where you were hunting and pecking a little bit more at your keys. So rapid texters might find the keyboard here a little bit cramped, but the good thing is you can of course use the traditional Google keyboard if you want to. You can also search by voice, so there's a ton of different options. Alright, so we're loading up the full version of the New York Times here, and you can see that over Wi-Fi, it actually seems to do a reasonably good job. You can see that the page renders after a few seconds of waiting. Definitely not as fast, of course, as the latest flagship chip running on a Snapdragon 800 series chipset, but the overall performance here isn't too bad. Once it is loaded, you can see everything scrolls and renders fine, and the New York Times is a very complex page with lots of moving elements, lots of ads, movies, video clips embedded onto it, so it's a good benchmark to test out performance on many lower powered chipsets will struggle. But on here, it actually seems to do quite well. Text reflows fairly quickly as well. So the overall web browsing experience here in 2018 still holds up. Now let's try the video playback experience. It really isn't a huge difference with web browsing, and you can tell that very little buffering times in between the videos, and you can really tell the deep colors as well as the impressive again, saturation levels of a Super AMOLED panel. It really just pops the colors, especially between contrast of lighter and darker shades, and this is no exception. Overall scrubbing between video parts is still quite fast and fluid. Right now the Wi-Fi router is quite far from this particular room, but you can still tell how everything is fully loading up without any problems. The speaker quality again is quite loud.
Tasks, but I wouldn't use this as a primary camera or anything like that. You have these standard,
although it is very easily muffled up because it is placed on the rear. So audio quality is passable for some quick clips, but if you're listening to long time movies, or if you're watching and listening to an album, I would recommend plugging in headphones or using Bluetooth speakers or earphones. Again, one of the benefits though is that this is a waterproof phone, so you can get it wet and all the components will still be fully working despite the presence of rubber flaps, which is actually a pretty clever design from Samsung here. Alright, so that is basically all the core features. Of course, all the utilities that you would find on this phone, including calculators and alarms, all those things don't really change with time. Performance still holds up, of course, with these very light programs and apps. And at the end of the day, I would say that the Galaxy S5 Mini, in terms of general performance, is actually still surprisingly capable here in 2018. It performs without too many issues or hiccups, really. At the end, I would say that whether or not this is still a phone that's worthwhile for you to pick up depends on several factors. The first one would be that you really are looking for a compact phone. If you're someone who really thinks that a full 5-inch phone or even 5.5 inches is too large, then something like this, which has a 4.5-inch display but doesn't sacrifice too much on performance and quality, remains a good choice. In fact, an increasingly rare choice, because more and more phones these days don't even give you an option with a 4.5-inch screen. The second thing would be that you don't need to play back the most intensive and demanding games and titles. Although it multitasks pretty well and performance is generally smooth and snappy, just keep in mind that again the phone itself is technically 3 years old, and even when it came out, it was never really a true flagship. So although it handles RAM management actually surprisingly well, it's not going to be the fastest in terms of performance. It's still very fluid, but sometimes you have to wait for a few seconds for things to completely load and render. The third thing would be, you're someone who doesn't really care too much about specs, but you want something that performs well enough. And that's basically the general trend with the phone, is that it works well enough. It has, again, half the megapixel count of the actual S5, 8 megapixels compared to 16, 1.5 gigs of RAM compared to 3 gigs of RAM, and obviously more is going to be better. It's going to be future-proof, but at the moment, it still holds up in terms of regular performance. Phone call quality also seems quite good. Obviously, the water resistancy also seems to be, again, pretty good. At $80, I would say that it does face competition, though, if those factors aren't necessarily super important to you. For instance, if you're someone who thinks that a 5-inch phone is acceptable, then there are many options, perhaps even by Xiaomi, that are coming out now with newer software. It's going to get you longer support, performance that's very similar, perhaps even a little bit faster, that is arguably going to be better here in 2018, because it will last you for a longer period of time without having to worry about the software getting outdated or no longer supported in the future. Furthermore, the Galaxy S5 Mini, although it is waterproof, doesn't have a very good build quality, as evidenced by the chrome plastic ring and the soft touch strangely textured back. But overall, it does have a very rich set of features that you'll seldom find at this particular price point, including a biometric heart rate sensor, in addition to a fingerprint scanner and that water resistancy in a compact form factor. So a very unique, almost unusual phone now in 2018 because of those attributes. But you have to be careful that you fall into that demographic, and that is the reason why you would want to pick this up. Otherwise, if you think a 5-inch phone or a 5.5-inch phone is susceptible, I would say that it's probably a better bet to get a newer device that can be found now for about the same price. You can also check out the Huawei Honor X series that gets you similar performance at a similar price now. So thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews. This was a throwback review of the Samsung Galaxy S5 Mini.